Welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was a particularly cruel winter. I remember when a curious case wove its way into the quiet chambers of Baker Street. The December fog hung thick over London, rendering every gaslight a blurred halo and every figure on the pavement a ghost. Holmes had taken to sitting in his armchair with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, scarcely moving save to rise for fresh tobacco or a violin flourish. Days passed in silence, broken only by the occasional newspaper rustle or the crackling fire. It was on the 6th day of such quietude that the curious letter arrived. I had just returned from my morning rounds at St. Bartholomew's when I found Holmes examining a sheet of creamy parchment, sealed with a red wax crest bearing the impression of a lion rampant and a knight's helm. "A baronet," he muttered, "or someone desperate to appear." I raised an eyebrow and removed my gloves. "What is it?" Holmes tossed the letter to me with a flick of his hand. "Read, Watson." The writing was meticulous, almost painfully precise. It bore the heading Greystone Hall, Northumberland, and read, "Mr. Holmes, a tragedy of impossible nature has befallen us. Last evening, my uncle, Sir Benedict Rivingham, was found dead in his study. The door was locked from the inside. The window bars are untouched. No trace of entry or exit. Beside him lay the remains of an ancient map, melted beyond recognition under the flame of a single still-burning candle. I implore you, sir, Scotland Yard has arrived and declared it a suicide, but that is nonsense. My uncle was terrified in his final days. Of what, I do not know, but he confided in me that he believed someone was watching him. You are my last hope. Please hurry. Clarence Rivingham." When I looked up, Holmes was already donning his coat. "Well," he said with that familiar gleam in his eye, "does it not strike you as singular?" I nodded slowly. A locked room, a melted map, and a candle that survived the inferno. Singular indeed. Holmes smiled thinly. "The candle is the key, Watson. It always is." We arrived at Greystone Hall 2 days later, the great house shrouded in frost and silence. Its towering iron gates groaned in protest as we were led through by a stone-faced butler named Hensley. The estate sprawled atop a lonely hill, flanked by naked oaks and blanketed in a thick crust of snow that muffled every step up. Mr. Clarence Rivingham greeted us in the drawing-room. A thin man of about 30, his pale face wore the tight, haggard look of recent grief. He shook our hands with trembling fingers. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson." Holmes nodded curtly. "You said your uncle spoke of being watched." Clarence nodded. "Yes." He had grown increasingly paranoid, always locking doors, whispering about the wax, though he never explained what he meant. "The wax," Holmes repeated sharply. "Yes. 3 days before he died, I overheard him say, 'They'll come for it, you'll see. But the wax will speak when I cannot.'" We exchanged glances. Clarence continued, "I thought it was the ranting of an old man. But now, take us to the study," Holmes said. The room was precisely as Clarence had described, if anything, too precise. A grand mahogany desk stood in the center, and behind it, an overstuffed leather chair, now ominously empty. The fireplace was cold. The only light came from the frosted windows, casting pale beams over the room's somber contents. Holmes moved with a dancer's grace, eyes darting over every detail. He paused beside the desk. "Where was the body found?" Slumped forward in the chair, Clarence said. "And the map?" Clarence pointed. There, atop the desk, sat a sheet of heavy parchment, now crumpled, blistered, and melted into itself as though a candle had burned through its center. Next to it, still upright in its holder, was the candle in question, half melted. Its wick burned black. Holmes bent over it. "Curious," he murmured. "The candle has burned for no more than 2 hours, but the wax on the map shows signs of prolonged heat. And look here." He reached for a magnifying lens and examined the desk. No drip marks, Not a single drop of wax beyond this contained area. Could the map have been burned elsewhere? I asked. Holmes tapped his fingers together. Unlikely. The paper beneath it is pristine. If it were moved, there would be scorch marks, soot residue of some kind. No, this damage was done here, and only here. Clarence said. Scotland Yard dismissed it, called it an accident, suggested he'd tried to burn the map and panicked. Holmes sniffed and locked the door behind himself before collapsing. No, there's a story in this wax. Watson, he circled the room, then stopped at the door. Locked from the inside, you said. Clarence nodded. Yes, we had to break it open. The constables confirmed the bolt was drawn. No keys were missing. None. Holmes turned to the window, examined the iron bars, and grunted. Sealed tight. No signs of tampering. I frowned. Then how could anyone have entered or escaped? That, Holmes said softly, is the question. But I believe the map may hold the answer. He returned to the desk and peered closer. The parchment is old. Pre-Victorian, I'd wager. Possibly older. Look at the fiber. Hand-pressed. And here, what's this? He pointed to a small symbol barely visible at the bottom of the sheet, a faded, wax-sealed crest partially melted into the paper itself. It was shaped like a triangle within a circle, arcane, unrecognized, yet unsettlingly precise. I believe this was no ordinary map, Holmes said, and Sir Benedict Rivingham did not die by chance. He straightened and turned to us both. There's something more at play. A hidden design, and the wax. Watson, the wax is trying to tell us something. Chapter 2. A consultation in Baker Street. The following morning found us once again within the comfortable, if disorderly, confines of 2-1B Baker Street. The journey from Northumberland had been swift but silent, Holmes having retreated deeply into thought, speaking only to request my silence, which I gladly granted as I stirred the fire back to life and set the kettle to boil. Holmes stood at the window, unmoving, eyes lost in the thick curtain of London fog. You saw the wax pattern, Watson? He asked at last. Indeed, but I must confess, I can make no more of it than the Yard did. The map was destroyed, and the candle burned unevenly. It may have been an accident. Then let us hope it was, Holmes replied absently. For if it was not, we face a foe of rare precision. He turned suddenly and paced toward the desk, where he had laid out his small leather-bound notebook and several sheets of cream paper. Without sitting, he scribbled something quickly, then tore the paper in half and handed one portion to me. Note the spacing of the melted edges. I glanced down. Holmes had sketched a rough outline of the map as we had seen it, mostly destroyed save for the outer margins. He'd shaded in a large blackened circle that suggested the path of the melting. I took its measurements while Clarence attended to the inspector. He said, the wax did not melt randomly. It formed a nearly perfect spiral, a geometric progression, one not easily created by a single candle unless directed. I raised my eyebrows. Directed? Holmes folded his arms. There was no draft in that room, no signs of tilting or tampering with the holder. But the burn pattern tells another story. It suggests movement, a guided descent of heat upon a specific portion of the paper, as though someone knew exactly what they wished to erase, and left the rest to confuse us. I added, precisely. I sat beside him, but the door was locked. The window is barred. Clarence himself found his uncle's body. If there was an intruder, he left neither mark nor trace. Holmes nodded, which suggests either a very clever murderer, or that our assumptions are flawed. He lit his pipe and drew deeply. There are two things which bother me most. First, the victim's final words, the wax will speak when I cannot. A phrase of deliberate intent. Would you not agree? I nodded. Second, the symbol we glimpsed beneath the remaining seal, the triangle within the circle. It bears resemblance to ancient cartographic guilds, particularly the Order of Flamewrights, a now defunct society rumored to encode maps in wax relief rather than ink. Encoded maps in wax, I repeated. But why? Holmes blew a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. Because wax could conceal terrain, elevation, or route when cooled. A secret road, perhaps, a buried location. But such maps could only be read under specific conditions, by melting at an exact temperature and observing the way the wax would shifted. And the spiral, I said slowly, was the message, not the mistake. Holmes smiled. Watson, you do yourself credit. We fell silent for a time, the wind tapping against the window panes. But what? I asked finally. would be so valuable to destroy that one would stage an entire suicide to do it? Holmes' eyes narrowed. That is precisely the question. And it leads us to motive. He moved to the sideboard and extracted from the bottom drawer a long roll of parchment he had taken from the study. I removed this from the bookshelf near Sir Benedict's desk. It appears to be one of his own hand-drawn maps, remarkably detailed, though unrelated to the one destroyed. He spread it across the table. The parchment displayed an elaborate coastline, dotted with annotations in Latin, and peculiar markings in crimson wax at intervals. I bent closer. Coordinates, possibly, or code. But more curiously, there is no mention of the name of the region. It is deliberately anonymous. And see here, he pointed to a small corner. This legend is written in a cipher. I've seen only once before, during the Kensington manuscript theft, 3 years ago. I stared. You think Sir Benedict was involved in cartographic forgery? Forgery? No. Holmes' voice grew sharper. I believe Sir Benedict was a guardian of something, a keeper of knowledge, hidden by mapmakers and smugglers alike. Knowledge that someone wanted destroyed. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a tray of tea and shortbread, smiling kindly despite our obvious preoccupation. Gentlemen, you've had nothing since morning, and I won't have you chasing ghosts on an empty stomach. Holmes offered a brief nod of gratitude. A ghost, indeed, Mrs. Hudson, a ghost of wax and paper. Once she had gone, Holmes poured 2 cups and resumed his pacing. There remains one further detail. Watson, you may have missed it, but I observed Clarence Rivingham's hands. His hands, calloused, not from riding or fencing, but from pressure and heat, precisely the marks left by someone who has spent considerable time handling wax molds. I stiffened. You think Clarence? I think, Holmes interrupted calmly, that Clarence Rivingham knows far more about his uncle's map than he has admitted, but whether he is guilty, or merely afraid, remains to be seen. He tapped the table lightly. Our next move is clear. We must investigate the history of Sir Benedict Rivingham, his expeditions, his patrons, and any recent visitors to Greystone Hall in the past fortnight. He glanced toward the morning paper beside the hearth, unread and folded neatly, because whoever sought to erase that map, he said softly, may not be done just yet. Chapter 3. A scene of deception. It was early afternoon when we found ourselves once again approaching Greystone Hall, its Gothic stone facade brooding under a low-hanging sky. The journey from London had been swifter this time, and Holmes had been uncharacteristically talkative, musing aloud on patterns of heat, obscure cartographic societies, and the properties of candle wax, as though he were rehearsing an opera no one else could yet. Here, the great iron gates creaked open at our approach, and we were met on the gravel path by the butler, Hensley, whose dour expression remained unchanged. Mr. Rivingham is in the conservatory, sir, he said with a curt nod. Shall I show you through the study once more? If you please, Holmes replied, already stepping past him. The study was just as we had left it, too neat, too staged, as though it had been cleaned with care not to disturb the illusion of disarray. The broken wax map still lay atop the desk, now stored beneath a glass case, as though it were a relic in a museum rather than a piece of evidence. Holmes gave it only a passing glance before turning his full attention to the fireplace. Note the soot line, he said, crouching. The bricks above the grate are darkened unevenly, suggesting something once hung there, recently removed. A painting, perhaps, more likely a framed document. The discoloration is rectangular, and the layer of ash beneath it is thin, suggesting it was taken down no more than a week ago. He stood and examined the mantel, and yet Clarence made no mention of this. Curious, he moved next to the desk drawers, opening each with delicate precision. I stood back, notebook in hand, attempting to chronicle his every movement, though the speed of his deductions made it near impossible to keep pace. Here, Watson, he said at last, holding up a small folded paper. What do you make of this? I took it carefully. The paper was stiff with age, and bore a charcoal rubbing of a seal knot, unlike the one we had glimpsed burned into the melted map. This version, however, was more intact, the same triangle within the circle, but with a Latin phrase encircling it in cramped script. In veritas, in flame, truth, I translated. Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed, it is a motto, Watson, and a very deliberate one. He moved to the window then, glancing out at the snow-covered gardens beyond. This room is a theatre, he said. Everything in it has been arranged for a particular audience. He tapped the glass lightly. but it's what's not here that speaks volumes. At that moment, the door opened and Clarence Rivingham entered, a look of polite surprise on his face. "I didn't expect you back so soon, Mr. Holmes. Has something new come to light?" Holmes turned slowly. "Several things, Mr. Rivingham, not least of which is the absence of a framed document once hung above the fireplace. Might I inquire as to its nature?" Clarence hesitated just for a breath, but it was enough. "It was a charter," he said, "an old family deed. I had it removed the day after my uncle's death. Too painful a reminder." Holmes said nothing, merely offered the faintest of nods. Clarence continued, "If there's anything you need from me, I'll be in the library." When he left, Holmes waited a beat before speaking. "Did you see his shoes, Watson?" I blinked. I didn't look. They were damp mud along the heel, yet it hasn't snowed since last night. He's been outside. He crossed to the far wall and tapped the paneling lightly. I suspect the charter was no deed, but another map, or a cipher, removed, not out of grief, but necessity. He turned abruptly. "Come, Watson, we must examine the grounds. I believe the garden may hold a deception deeper than any in this room." Outside, the air bit through our coats as we made our way down a narrow path that wound behind the estate. The hedges were tall and neatly trimmed, though patches of frost gave them a ghostly sheen. Holmes stopped suddenly near a rusted iron gate. There he knelt, brushing aside the snow. Beneath it, faint boot prints recent and narrow, heading toward a small greenhouse set apart from the main grounds, but he followed them. Inside, the greenhouse was warm, humid, with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. Vines curled up the iron frames, and water dripped steadily from the roof. But Holmes ignored the plants entirely and made straight for a wooden work table at the back. Upon it lay a strange collection of tools molds, shallow metal trays, and a set of carving instruments. "Waxwork," Holmes murmured. He picked up a metal press and turned it over in his hands, used for stamping impressions. "Look here, Watson, this mold is an exact match for the triangle and circle seal we saw on the burned map." I stared. "You think Clarence forged the map?" Holmes shook his head. "No. He may have tried to reproduce part of it, or decode it, but someone else wanted it destroyed. The question is, did Clarence know what he was protecting, or did he tamper with something beyond his understanding?" He paused, then knelt to inspect the floorboards. "One plank is loose," he said quietly. He pried it up, and beneath it, tucked inside a hollow compartment, was a folded oilskin envelope. Holmes removed it, opened it, and extracted a small sheet of what appeared to be vellum. He held it to the light. Faint outlines shimmered across its surface, geographic in nature, marked with obscure coordinates and symbols I could make no sense of. In one corner, the same triangle and circle seal was branded in deep crimson wax. Holmes smiled. It seems the wax did speak, after all. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. We returned to Greystone Hall with the oilskin envelope carefully tucked inside Holmes' coat pocket. Though the wind had risen and snow began to fall in gentle flurries, Holmes' pace quickened, as though some unseen current had begun pulling him toward a deeper, darker truth. Inside, Clarence was nowhere to be found. Instead, Hensley met us near the main stair, his lined face drawn tighter than before. "There are guests, sir," he said to Holmes with a stiff bow. "Arrived within the hour." Holmes arched a brow. "Guests? Yes. Miss Lavinia Rivingham and Mr. Giles Weatherford. Miss Lavinia is the late Sir Benedict's niece, Clarence's cousin. Mr. Weatherford claims to be a solicitor regarding the estate." "Claims," Holmes repeated. Hensley's jaw tensed. "He's not known to the family, sir, but Miss Lavinia vouched for him." Holmes glanced at me. "The plot thickens, Watson. We found the pair seated in the drawing room. Lavinia Rivingham was a striking woman, early 30s, poised and sharp-eyed, dressed in mourning black that did nothing to diminish the pride in her bearing. She stood as we entered, and I caught a flash of recognition in her eyes as she took in Holmes' figure. "You're Mr. Holmes," she said. "Clarence mentioned you'd returned." Holmes offered a slight bow. "And you must be Miss Ruff. A difficult time for your family." Her gaze flicked briefly to the hearth. "Grief seems oddly still in this house." Seated beside her was a tall, angular man in his 40s, with a meticulously trimmed beard and wire spectacles that lent his eyes a bird-like intensity. His fingers tapped a leather folder on his knee with unconscious precision. "I am Giles Weatherford," he said, without invitation. "Sir Benedict retained me for matters relating to his overseas investments." I came to secure a number of documents, though Clarence has been ... evasive. Holmes sat across from them. Documents, you say? Weatherford nodded. Land charters, mostly. Some old trade maps, quite valuable to the right party. With Sir Benedict's death, their legal standing is uncertain. Holmes folded his hands. How long have you been acquainted with Sir Benedict? 2 years. We met during a lecture on colonial cartography in Bath. He had a keen mind. Lavinia spoke then, her voice low but firm. My uncle was obsessed with secrecy, and with control. Even in his final days, he refused to explain half of what he kept locked in that study. Holmes looked at her with interest. And yet you've come now, despite that distance. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. Because Clarence wrote to me, said something wasn't right, that Uncle Ben had died with wax on his hands and fire in his eyes. I thought it poetic nonsense, until I saw the desk for myself. You inspected the study? Holmes asked. I did. Yesterday evening. Clarence allowed it. Her tone held a hint of defiance. I couldn't help but notice how Weatherford's jaw tightened at her answer. Did you see the melted map? Holmes asked. She nodded. What was left of it? Holmes leaned forward slightly. And what was your impression? She hesitated, as if unsure whether to answer honestly. It was a message, she said finally, or a warning, but it wasn't meant for Scotland Yard. Holmes' eyes sparkled faintly. For whom, then? She glanced at Weatherford. I couldn't say later, in the quiet of the library. Holmes paced slowly while I sat nearby, attempting to put our growing cast of characters into some coherent frame. We now have, I said, ticking them off, Clarence, the nervous heir, Lavinia, the thoughtful and skeptical niece, and Mr. Weatherford, whose presence seems more intrusive than helpful. Holmes nodded. Each of them connected to Sir Benedict in different ways, and each with a possible motive. Do you suspect Lavinia? I asked. Not yet. Her candor is too well measured. She may be hiding something, but I do not yet believe it to be guilt. And Weatherford? Holmes stopped pacing. A solicitor who appears before the will is even read, asking for maps. Curious, but his name checks out. I've sent a telegram to Bath to confirm the details of their association. Just then, Hensley entered with a silver tray. A letter, sir, delivered by hand not 5 minutes ago. No return address. Holmes took it, tore it open, and read. His expression didn't change, but I noticed the slightest crease form between his brows. Watson, read this. I took the letter and scanned its contents. You seek what was sealed in flame. You walk among liars. The wax was not the end but the gate. Leave the map alone, or more will burn. A friend. There was no signature. I looked up. A threat, an invitation. Holmes said softly. Someone knows we're close. He walked to the fire and stared into it. The wax was the gate, he murmured. And gates, Watson, are meant to keep something out or something in. Chapter 5. The first suspects. The red herring. The snow was falling more heavily the next morning, blanketing the hedgerows and rendering the grounds of Greystone Hall eerily silent. From the tall windows of the study, the trees beyond the garden resembled twisted sculptures, half lost in the whiteness. Inside, however, a different chill had settled, one not of winter, but of suspicion. Holmes stood at the fireplace once again, his eyes fixed not on the hearth, but on the faint discoloration where the mysterious document had once hung. We now know, he said slowly, that the map was not the first thing to vanish. Whoever removed the item above the fireplace did so before Sir Benedict's death, and yet no one has spoken of it. He turned to me, which means either they didn't notice, which is unlikely, or they noticed and chose not to mention it. I set my teacup aside. You think the theft predates the murder? I believe the theft is the motive. At that moment, the door opened, and Inspector Lestrade entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. He looked cold, irritated, and very much out of place among the dark wood and aristocratic gloom. Holmes, he said without preamble, you've stirred quite a nest this time. Scotland Yard wasn't even finished with the paperwork before you started sending telegrams across half of England. Holmes smiled. Did they answer? Lestrade snorted. Of course they did. Giles Weatherford is legitimate. He's a solicitor. All right, specializes in recovering lost property for defunct colonial families. He's helped reclaim land in Jamaica and East Africa, according to the records. Holmes nodded. And Clarence? Lestrade gave a non-committal shrug. Bit of a dullard, but nothing criminal. Squandered much of his allowance trying to fund a private expedition to Newfoundland last year. Failed, of course. He's up to his ears in debt. Holmes glanced at me. There's our first suspect, Watson. Desperation often breeds boldness. I frowned. But would he murder his uncle for a map? Holmes didn't answer. He crossed the room and picked up the folded oilskin envelope we had retrieved from beneath the greenhouse floorboards. He might if he believed this led to something tangible, something hidden. Remember, Sir Benedict wasn't merely a collector of maps. He was a man who guarded knowledge, and knowledge, in the right hands, becomes power or wealth. Lestrade cleared his throat. For what it's worth, I interviewed the staff, all loyal, all alibi. But one of the footmen did recall Clarence and Weatherford arguing 3 nights before the death. Holmes' eyes flicked toward the ceiling. Did he hear what was said? Only fragments. Something about what lies beneath, and no one else must see it. Typical melodrama. Holmes turned sharply. We need to speak with Clarence now. We found him in the billiards room, cue in hand, though the balls remained untouched. His back was to us as he stared at the table's green velvet surface with an expression of troubled detachment. Mr. Rivingham, Holmes began. You neglected to mention a quarrel with Mr. Weatherford. Clarence turned slowly. It was nothing. According to your staff, it was heated enough to wake the house. Clarence sighed and set the cue aside. He was pressing me about a charter he believed my uncle still possessed. He claimed it pointed to a hidden tract of land somewhere in the East Indies, I believe. Said the original would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. I told him I didn't have it. And do you? Holmes asked quietly. Clarence hesitated. No, I've searched. I truly don't. Holmes stepped closer. And yet, you have the tools to make wax impressions. You visited the greenhouse after our last conversation. You knew exactly where the oilskin envelope was hidden. Clarence's face paled. I didn't kill him. If that's what you're implying, I'm implying nothing. But your actions are evasive. Why conceal the envelope? Clarence lowered his voice. Because I didn't trust Weatherford or Lavinia. They both showed up within hours of each other, both asking questions about maps, both hinting that they were entitled to something more. I thought if there was something valuable, I might find it first. I thought, ... double quotes, he trailed off. You thought you could use it to fix your debts. Holmes finished. Clarence nodded, his voice thin. Yes, there was silence. Holmes turned to Lestrade. He's lying about something, but not the murder. Lestrade frowned. Then who's your man? Holmes moved to the billiard table and leaned against it. Not a man, not yet. We're still inside the illusion. That evening, Lavinia invited us to join her in the sitting room. A fire crackled in the grate, and she poured tea herself with a care that seemed to come from years of restraint rather than warmth. My uncle was difficult, she said, but he believed in something. I think he thought he was protecting the world from it. From what? I asked. She hesitated. A place, or perhaps an idea, something he discovered abroad. He came back from Alexandria, a changed man. Holmes' eyes narrowed. When was this? 3 years ago. After that, he locked himself away. He grew paranoid, began collecting symbols, codes, maps layered in wax. He said the land was cursed not in superstition, but in history. Do you know where this land is? She shook her head. Only that it once belonged to an empire long erased, and that some people still want it. Holmes stood slowly. Then we must assume that someone in this house is not who they claim to be, and that what was burned was not merely a map but a key. Chapter 6. The secret clue, a hidden inconsistency. The following morning it dawned grey and heavy with mist. The snowfall had ceased, but the frost remained clinging to the window panes, lining the stone balustrades like pale lace. Holmes and I breakfasted in the library. A silent affair save for the occasional flutter of newspaper pages or the faint scratch of Holmes' pen in his ever-growing notebook. He had slept little. I knew this from the clutter on the desk. Wax shavings, ash remnants, and several maps spread out like autopsy diagrams under his lens. Something had taken hold of him, a thought perhaps, still half-formed tugging at his mind like a thread he could not yet unravel. Watson, he said abruptly, when is something missing, but no one notices it's gone? I looked up, caught off guard. Pardon. He stood and paced to the fire, when it never belonged in the room to begin with or, rather, when it was hidden in plain sight, but meant to vanish. He turned back to me. The candle, Watson, the one that burned the map. He nodded. Yes, we assumed it was an ordinary taper, placed by Sir Benedict or the intruder. But what if it wasn't? What if it was part of the cipher itself? I set down my fork. You mean intentional? designed to burn the wax in a specific way. Precisely, he moved to the sideboard, where he had placed the half-melted candle days earlier. From the base, he extracted a sliver of metal embedded in the wax, a tiny pin, nearly invisible to the eye. "This," he said, holding it up to the morning light, "is no ordinary wick anchor. It's a guide used in laboratory settings to regulate burn rate. In other words, it's been tampered with, adjusted to control how fast, how far, and in what pattern the wax melted." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're suggesting someone engineered the candle to reveal or erase specific information on the map?" "I'm suggesting the candle was the mechanism, Watson, and that the person who placed it there knew exactly what they were doing." At that moment, Hensley appeared at the door. "Mr. Holmes, Miss Rivingham requests a word in the study." Holmes gave a curt nod. "Tell her I'll join her shortly." When the butler had gone, Holmes turned back to me, his eyes keen. "Someone in this house understands waxwork better than they pretend. We assumed Clarence's tools in the greenhouse were suspicious, but Clarence is a fumbling amateur." "Then who?" Holmes tapped his index finger against the desk. "Let's see what Miss Lavinia has to say." "We found her standing near the very spot where Sir Benedict had died, beside the desk, one gloved hand resting on the glass case that now protected the ruined map. I've been thinking," she said without preamble, "about the phrase you quoted last night. The wax was not the end but the gate. It struck me as ... familiar." She reached into her satchel and drew out a small leather journal. "This belonged to my uncle. I recovered it from his bedside table. I hadn't thought much of it until now." Holmes took the journal carefully. Its pages were filled with tight, angular script drawings of symbols, wax stamp designs, and notes in Latin. Holmes skimmed quickly, then paused on one particular entry. "The map can only be read in destruction. Let the wax form its spiral and speak. Flame is the cipher, wax, the key, heat, the hand that reveals." Holmes looked up. "This confirms it. Your uncle devised a system, perhaps learned from the Order of Flame Rites, or invented on his own, that allowed information to be encoded in wax, but only revealed when burned with a specific configuration." Lavinia nodded. "He wrote of it like a sacred ritual, almost as though he feared what it would reveal." "Did he ever show it to you?" "No. But when I was young, I remember he'd sit for hours with candles, dripping wax onto old maps and watching how it cooled. I thought it was some eccentric hobby." "Eccentric, yes," Holmes murmured, "but hardly harmless." He turned to me. "Watson, we must re-examine the candle holder itself. It may contain more than just soot and wax." Back in the study, Holmes removed the candle holder from the desk and disassembled it with delicate precision. From its hollow stem, he retrieved a tightly folded slip of parchment, stained faintly with ash. Carefully, he unfolded it and laid it flat across the desk. It contained a series of coordinate 6 digits, repeated in a spiral pattern, matching the spiral left in the melted wax. Beneath them, a phrase in Greek, "Let the flame remember what time will forget." Holmes stared at the parchment for a long moment. "This," he said, "was never meant to be found by accident. It's part of a sequence, a puzzle only solvable by one who knew both the cipher and the flame's intended path." He turned to me, his voice low. "Someone wanted to find what Sir Benedict had hidden, but they lacked the full method. So they burned the map, hoping it would guide them. But they were impatient and careless. Whoever it was," I said, "they may still be watching." Holmes nodded. "Which means they may strike again." That evening, as the shadows grew long across Greystone's corridors, Holmes sat in silence beside the fire, the cipher parchment folded neatly beside him. I knew the look in his eyes far away, calculating, sharpening itself against the grain of human deception. "Watson," he said softly, "we're no longer solving a murder. We are following a trail laid decades ago, one meant to disappear in smoke and flame, and the next piece of the puzzle will not be found in wax." He looked toward the window. "It will be found in blood." Chapter 7. The crime grows was just past 2 in the morning when the knock came at our door. Holmes, fully dressed and seated by the fire, did not seem surprised. I, having only just dozed off in the armchair, started awake and blinked at the figure of Hensley in the threshold, his face pale as bone, his voice low and strained. "There's been another incident, sir. You'd best come at once." Holmes was already on his feet, coat in hand. "Where?" "The library, sir." "Miss Rivingham." My heart sank. The scene was a shattered reflection of the heavy curtains, drawn tight against the night. The fire burned low, and Lavinia seated in a high-backed chair, her face ghost white. Her gloved hands trembled in her lap. Just behind her stood Clarence wide-eyed, and to the left of the hearth, arms crossed and scowling, stood Giles Weatherford. Holmes strode into the room, eyes flicking across every surface, every angle. "She's not harmed," Clarence said quickly. "Shaken, that's all." "I was asleep," Lavinia said in a tight, distant voice. "Something woke me, a creaking sound. When I opened my eyes, someone was in the room." "In your room?" Holmes asked sharply. She nodded. "They were crouched near my desk. They didn't see me at first. When I sat up and gasped, they ran through the hall and down the stairs. I followed, but I lost them in the corridor. I shouted, and Clarence came." "You're certain it was a man?" Holmes asked. "No, I couldn't tell. They wore a cloak, hooded, moved quickly, deliberately." Holmes turned to Clarence. "You saw no face?" "No, I only saw the door swinging shut as I arrived." Weatherford scoffed. "This is absurd. A phantom thief. And what, pray, were they searching for in the lady's chamber? A missing map? A confession?" Holmes ignored him. Instead, he walked to the desk near the far wall where Lavinia's papers lay scattered. He examined the lock forced, the brass twisted by a sharp tool. Then he lifted one of the crumpled pages. "You kept your uncle's journal here?" Lavinia's eyes flashed. "Yes, it's gone." A pause. The tension in the room tightened like a wire. Holmes turned. This was no opportunist. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Later that morning, Holmes and I stood alone in the corridor where Lavinia had claimed to chase the intruder. The torches had long since gone out, and only the weak grey light of dawn reached through the windows. Holmes examined the floor carefully. "No mud," he muttered. "No debris. But here, look." I leaned in. Faint scuffs along the wall just beneath the wainscot. A single thread, dark, coarse, clinging to a splinter near the doorframe. "Wool," Holmes said, carefully plucking it loose. "From a heavy cloak. And this mark, someone braced themselves here while listening, possibly moments before entering." He straightened. This wasn't panic. It was premeditated, and it was someone who knew this house well enough to move silently in the dark. I rubbed my eyes. Could it have been Clarence? Holmes shook his head. No, he was genuinely surprised and terrified, but his cynicism was forced this time. A performance. He's beginning to feel the net close around him. We were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, looking unusually grim. "I've just come from the local post," he said. "Intercepted a letter sent yesterday afternoon from the Greystone grounds. No return address, but we tracked it back to the servant's box by the rear gate." He handed the folded message to Holmes. "The journal was incomplete. The cipher is broken, but there is still another. The flame cannot hide the path forever. If she knows more, she'll be silenced next. No signature." Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me. "They're becoming desperate," he said, "which means they're close to discovery. But I'm still grasping for the final key. She'll be silenced." I echoed. "They mean Lavinia." "Undoubtedly, and if they fail to find what they seek, they may turn to violence more direct than fire." By afternoon, Holmes had taken to the garden once more, retracing steps with a peculiar restlessness that told me his mind was burning ahead of his body. I followed behind, notebook in hand. At the edge of the hedge maze, he stopped suddenly and turned toward a moss-covered statue of a griffin, one I had barely noticed before. "This," he said, "was not here 2 days ago." I stared. "You're certain?" "Absolutely. Look at the base, fresh soil. It's been moved, possibly hollow." He crouched and tapped the base. A dull echo. Using a nearby spade, Holmes dug quickly, and after only a few inches of soil, uncovered a hinged panel beneath the statue's footing. Inside, draped in oilcloth, was a second journal. Holmes opened it carefully. "Another of Sir Benedict's," he whispered. "Not notes, but letters. Dozens of them." He read a few lines, then closed the cover slowly. "These were not addressed to the family," he said. "They were to someone named Amir." "And the last page, .. double quotes." He paused. "It references something called the Meridian Vault." That night, as the house fell once more into uneasy quiet, Holmes sat in the study, turning over the journal page by page. I watched the light from the fireplace dance across his face, casting flickering shadows beneath his eyes. "You see, Watson," he said finally, "the crime is no longer isolated. The melted map, the candle, the cipher, they were only the beginning." He tapped the journal. "This speaks of something buried, something known only to a few and desperately sought by someone willing to kill to possess it." I believe the fire was meant to destroy the trail, but Sir Benedict left too many breadcrumbs. He looked at me, his voice low and resolute. And now that the game is truly afoot... the culprit will try again. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. It was some time before noon when Holmes abruptly rose from his chair, where he had been poring over Sir Benedict's second journal, and turned toward me with that gleam in his eye that always preceded action. "Watson, I believe the time has come to apply pressure to our adversary. A theory must be tested not in quiet reflection, but through movement and manipulation." He tucked the journal under his arm and rang for Hensley. "When Miss Lavinia and the other guests are gathered in the drawing room," Holmes said calmly, "please notify me. I shall need 10 uninterrupted minutes beforehand to prepare." "Of course, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned to me. "Our quarry is emboldened, Watson. Each step they take to suppress the past reveals more than they conceal. It is time to force a hand." An hour later, we found ourselves in the drawing room, where the thick scent of rosewood and polished brass hung heavy in the air. Holmes had requested the presence of all principal figures: Lavinia, Clarence, Giles Weatherford, and Inspector Lisle, who arrived with the bemused air of one accustomed to being upstaged. Holmes stood near the grand window, silhouetted against the glass. He held a sheet of parchment, folded twice, which he tapped idly against his fingers. "I thank you all for indulging me," he began. "A breakthrough has come to light regarding Sir Benedict's journal. Or, I should say his true journal." Weatherford shifted in his chair. "I thought the real one had been stolen last night." "Indeed," Holmes replied coolly. "Yet it appears Sir Benedict was cleverer than any of us. He kept not one, but 2 sets of records, and the second hidden within the pedestal of a griffin statue reveals something remarkable." He paused, eyes scanning the room. "In it, he refers repeatedly to a location known as the Meridian Vault. It seems to be tied to an expedition, one never documented in the official record, and known only to a trusted few, one of whom, I suspect, is still in this house." A sharp breath escaped from Lavinia, and Clarence furrowed his brow. Weatherford merely scoffed. "And what is this vault, Holmes?" "Some long-lost pirate treasure." Holmes smiled faintly. "You tell me, Mr. Weatherford, or shall I read from Sir Benedict's final letter where he claims the vault's key was hidden within a wax-pressed map, encoded with directional ciphers, and that he feared someone would attempt to destroy it?" Silence fell like a curtain. I watched their faces carefully. Clarence looked genuinely puzzled. Lavinia clutched the arm of her chair. Weatherford's expression had not changed, but his fingers had tightened around the stem of his brandy glass. Holmes continued, "I have also sent word to the British Museum, requesting records of Sir Benedict's private correspondences. There is mention in these pages of a man named Amron, a scholar he trusted implicitly. If Amron is still alive, we may soon hear from him." At this, Weatherford stood abruptly. "This is absurd. If you had real evidence, you wouldn't need parlor games and riddles. You'd call the constable and be done with it." "Ah," Holmes replied with a faint smirk, "but these are not riddles, Mr. Weatherford. They are stimuli, and reactions to them tell me more than confessions ever could." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I'd advise increasing security for Miss Rive. The intruder from last night was searching for this journal. They failed, and now they know someone else possesses it." Lestrade nodded, and Lavinia visibly paled. Holmes concluded, "We are no longer dealing with theft or curiosity. We are facing someone cornered and, therefore, dangerous." Later that evening, as the household settled once more into restless unease, Holmes and I took a walk beyond the stables under the fog-drenched sky. He spoke in a whisper, though no one was near. Weatherford's pulse quickened during my monologue. His glass hand clenched. His posture grew defensive. All the subtle tells of a man suddenly threatened, not because of what was said, but what might follow. "You think he's the one who broke into Lavinia's room?" "Not necessarily," Holmes said. "He may have an accomplice, or more likely, a pawn. The threat in that intercepted note was written by someone with intimate knowledge of the vault. Weatherford believes he knows where it lies, but he's missing the final piece." He paused, "and he believes Lavinia possesses it." We turned back toward the manor, the windows glowing like amber eyes in the dark. "But Lavinia doesn't," I said. "Does she?" Holmes was silent for several steps. "She may, but whether knowingly or not, I cannot yet say. There are phrases in Sir Benedict's letters that suggest he hid the key in a personal keepsake, within what I cherished most, a legacy only she would treasure. If Lavinia inherited that object unknowingly, then she may be in graver danger than she realizes. Back in our rooms, Holmes laid the journal on the desk and opened it to a page near the middle. He studied it carefully, brow furrowed. "Watson," he said at length, "there's a recurring phrase here, west of flame, where shadow grows longest," repeated thrice. Sir Benedict was fond of riddles, but if my theory holds— He rose suddenly and went to the hearth, where a small brass candlestick sat unused. Lighting it, he held the flame close to the edge of the journal's spine. Slowly, faint lines began to emerge, symbols pressed into the margin beneath the ink, a heat-reactive cipher. I breathed. Holmes nodded. "And now, at last, we may be closer to understanding the path our killer fears will follow." His eyes glinted with a satisfaction I had seen only in the most intricate of cases. "Tomorrow, Watson," he said, "we begin to draw them out, but not by chasing them. No, we shall let them come to us." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes. Again dawn broke with a reluctant pallor, the mist hanging thick in the air as if the very earth conspired to conceal secrets. There was little conversation over breakfast that morning. Lavinia's appetite had vanished entirely. Clarence merely picked at his kippers, and even Weatherford, who had previously exuded an air of smug composure, sat stiffly, his attention divided between his plate and the grandfather clock that ticked ominously in the hallway. Holmes, for his part, was quiet to quiet. His eyes flitted frequently toward the large sash window overlooking the eastern edge of the estate. There, just beyond the hedgerow, stood the greenhouse, its panes fogged from within, streaked with rain and condensation. I followed his gaze, expecting someone. "Holmes?" I asked. He offered me a faint smile. "Yes, I expect our phantom shall make another move before midday." "And you think they'll try again?" "After last night, they must," he murmured. "We forced their hand. The journal's existence and our knowledge of it makes us dangerous. Whoever seeks the map now operates under pressure, and desperation has a way of sharpening resolve or loosening caution." The household retired to their own devices shortly thereafter. Lavinia went to her late uncle's study, hoping to organize what remained of his private letters. Clarence took to the estate grounds, accompanied by his hound. Weatherford, claiming a headache, retired to his room with a flask of brandy and a book on Mesopotamian artifacts. Holmes, meanwhile, disappeared. I wandered the halls alone for a time, unsure of his whereabouts. It was nearly noon when I heard a sharp cry echo from the far end of the estate. I ran down the corridor, past the east gallery, and into the greenhouse annex where the outer door stood ajar. Mud had been tracked across the tiled floor. The air inside was humid and heavy with the scent of loam and roses, and the misted windows diffused the light into a ghostly haze. There, crouched amid shattered glass and overturned terracotta pots, was Clarence's lip bloodied, one sleeve torn, and his eyes wide with shock. She nearly killed me," he stammered, came at me like a devil knife in hand. I helped him to his feet as Lestrade arrived behind me, revolver drawn. Holmes, too, appeared seemingly out of nowhere, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" Lestrade demanded. Clarence pointed to a smashed panel in the rear wall of the greenhouse, where a hidden door stood open to the gardens. "I heard something movement in the porch, thought it was an animal, but when I stepped inside, someone came at me, female I think, but fast, strong, wearing dark clothes and a scarf across her face." "Did you see where she went?" "Out the rear toward the orchard." Lestrade and 2 constables gave chase. Holmes lingered behind, scanning the scene with rapid, darting movements. "Deliberate," he muttered. "She struck without intent to kill but enough to frighten." "Why?" He crouched and retrieved a broken shard of pottery. Embedded in the soil beneath it was a metal object, a thin brass disc, tarnished with age. Holmes brushed it clean, and a series of delicate etchings came into view. "Watson," he said quietly, "this was no attack. This was retrieved, back in the study." With Clarence now bandaged and resting under Lavinia's anxious care, Holmes laid the brass disc on the desk beneath a magnifying lens. I leaned in beside him. "What is it?" "A cipher plate," he said, "used in conjunction with a directional map, most likely the candlewax etching we've yet to fully decipher. This plate overlays specific symbols and determines their sequence." He paused. The intruder knew it was here, knew precisely where to look, which means Clarence's tale of surprise may not be entirely truthful. Or, Holmes added more softly, someone planted the disc earlier, knowing Clarence would discover it with convenient drama. A knock at the door interrupted us. Lestrade entered, breathing heavily. "We lost her," he grunted. "Whoever she is, she's fast and knows the grounds better than we do. No trace beyond the orchard." Holmes looked untroubled. "She served her purpose." Lestrade blinked. "You let her go?" "I never intended to catch her," Holmes replied. "I needed her to act a move and she did." Holmes turned back to the desk. "There's a second layer to this mystery. Sir Benedict's journals, the vault, the cipher. That's merely the stage. The true performance lies in who is maneuvering behind the curtain, and that," he tapped the cipher plate, "narrows our suspects to one of two people." "Who?" I asked, but Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. Not until the trap is complete." That evening, Holmes summoned Miss Lavinia to the drawing room. The fire was lit, and the candle-wax map had been laid on the table, now joined by the cipher plate. "Miss Rivingham," Holmes said gently, "do you recognize this?" She peered at it, her brow furrowing. "No, though it looks somewhat like the base of my music box, the one Uncle Benedict gave me when I was a child." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Where is this music box now?" "In my bedroom cabinet, I believe. I haven't touched it in years. May I trouble you to retrieve it?" Lavinia left the room, returning moments later with a small, carved rosewood box. Holmes accepted it delicately, then flipped it over. A shallow impression had been worked into the base, as if something once sat flush within it. Holmes held the cipher plate above it. It matched perfectly. "Elementary," he whispered. "Sir Benedict gave her the key long ago. She's had it all this time, unknowingly." He turned to me. "Watson, the vault's location is nearly within our grasp, and someone knows it. Tomorrow, we will let them command. We will be waiting." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. This morning broke grey and cool over Rivingham Manor, with a drizzling rain that blurred the outlines of the trees and smeared the windows in faint streaks. The household stirred slowly. The tension from the previous day thick in the air like the mist on the lawn. No word had come from the elusive attacker. Clarence, though bruised and noticeably more cautious, insisted he was well enough to walk the grounds. Lavinia kept to herself, speaking little over breakfast. Even Weatherford seemed to have retreated into his own quiet calculations, his brow furrowed, and his fingers absently tapping the rim of his teacup. Holmes was already up and about before I'd opened my eyes that morning. When I found him, he was seated once more in the drawing room, the candle-wax map laid out beside the cipher plate and Lavinia's music box, now dismantled to reveal a set of minute gears beneath a false panel. "I find it elegant," Holmes said as I entered, his eyes still on the map, a puzzle within a keepsake, entrusted not just to memory, but to sentiment. "You think Sir Benedict meant Lavinia to discover the cipher eventually?" I asked. "Perhaps," he replied, "or perhaps he meant her to pass it along unknowingly, should she fall into the wrong hands. The map's value lies not only in what it hides, but in how easily it could be overlooked." He paused, then gestured to a fresh sheet of paper beside him. "I've overlaid the cipher plate against the map's faint ridges. With careful tracing and rotational alignment, a pattern emerges, coordinates that suggest a very specific location." I leaned closer. "On the estate grounds?" "Not quite. The coordinates point toward the cliffs beyond the old gardener's path. A disused structure lies there, stone shelter, half collapsed and forgotten. I suspect it houses Sir Benedict's true vault." "You mean to go there today?" "Tonight," Holmes said, eyes narrowing, but not alone. That afternoon passed in a haze of strained civility. Holmes requested that the household gather in the drawing room once more, under the pretense of sharing the results of his investigation thus far. Weatherford, looking pale, came reluctantly. Clarence sat heavily in a wing-back chair, cradling a glass of brandy. Lavinia perched near the fireplace, hands folded tensely in her lap. "I have made certain discoveries," Holmes began, "but I must admit there remain pieces that do not yet align. The journal and the cipher have opened some doors, but motives remain elusive." Weatherford gave a short, bitter laugh. "If this is about the inheritance again, I should remind you, Mr. Holmes, that Sir Benedict had no heir." "Ah," Holmes said, "but he had intentions." He turned to Lavinia. "Miss Rivingham, your uncle trusted you, enough to hide the cipher in your music box, enough to let you live beneath his roof while he shielded something from the world. Did he ever speak of his vault in your presence?" Lavinia hesitated. "Only once. I was still a girl. He told me that if ever I felt lost, truly lost, I should look where the wind breaks against the stone. I thought it was a metaphor." Holmes's eyes gleamed. Not a metaphor, Miss Rivingham. Instruction. Clarence frowned. So what now? We find the vault, and then what? We turn it over to the Crown. That depends on what lies within, Holmes said quietly. But tonight, I will go there and I would like one of you to come with me. He let the silence settle heavily. Volunteers, he added. Lavinia, to my surprise, spoke first. I'll come. Holmes gave a polite nod. Very well. After supper, wear boots. Later that evening, Holmes pulled me aside. Why her? I asked. You know the intruder wasn't Lavinia. Precisely. Which makes her the one person I can trust to witness what we find. He turned away from me and added in a whisper, but I believe someone will attempt to get there first. Then what's the plan? We let them. We follow and observe. Nightfall came early, with the rain finally lifting and stars blinking into view through torn clouds. Holmes, Lavinia, and I slipped out of the manor at 9:30, cutting across the damp lawn toward the gardener's path. The cliffs loomed in the distance, rising like ancient sentinels over the sea. Halfway down the path, Holmes raised a hand and crouched behind a low hedge. We joined him silently. There, several yards ahead, a lantern bobbed in the darkness. A lone figure, cloaked and hooded, hurried toward the ruins near the cliff's edge. Holmes gave me a look. I could see it now. This was his trap. We would not enter the vault as first discoverers, but as witnesses to someone else's desperation. We crept behind the figure at a distance, our footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The wind rose as we reached the cliffs, carrying the smell of salt and distant waves. The stone shelter stood like a hunched beast against the horizon, half buried in earth. Its arch partially collapsed. The figure disappeared inside. We waited. Holmes turned to Lavinia. Stay here. He and I crept forward until we reached the entrance. From within, we heard scraping stone grinding against stone and, then, a gasp. We peered inside. The cloaked figure had uncovered something, a steel chest embedded in the floor, its surface etched with strange symbols. The figure reached out with trembling hands, and then Holmes struck a match. The flame flickered to life, revealing the intruder's face. Mr. Weatherford, Holmes said evenly, you do choose the most dramatic settings. The archaeologist froze. For a moment, all pretense drained from his face. Holmes, he said with quiet contempt, you never did learn to stay in your lane. On the contrary, Holmes said, this path leads directly to yours. Chapter 11. The bait. Holmes' grand strategy. For a moment, the cold silence inside the vault pressed upon us like the weight of centuries. The flickering match in Holmes' hand cast long crooked shadows across the stone walls and the open steel chest before Weatherford. The archaeologist stood motionless, as if the very act of being seen had turned him to stone. Lavinia remained outside, her silhouette barely visible against the moonlight beyond the collapsed arch. I heard the wind pick up over the cliffs, sharp and restless. Holmes stepped forward, still holding the match low. You've worked very hard to reach this place, Mr. Weatherford. Nearly 2 decades, if I estimate correctly, but your timing is ... inconvenient. Weatherford recovered quickly. And what exactly am I accused of, Mr. Holmes? Investigating the history of a property I've lived on for most of my professional life. Holmes gave a thin smile. Your crimes lie not in curiosity, but in concealment. I found the original expedition notes in your study. You and Sir Benedict once stood here together, didn't you? Weatherford's jaw tightened. He swore me to secrecy, and then he outlived your patience. Holmes murmured. The wax map, the cipher, it was all a delay to you. A clever game that kept the vault just out of reach. I tried to protect it. Weatherford snapped suddenly. Do you even know what's in this chest? Holmes, do you understand what Sir Benedict hid here? Holmes raised a brow. I understand enough. That it's not gold, nor artifacts, but information. Something dangerous enough that he forged the myth of a treasure to distract from its real contents. Weatherford laughed bitterly. You're still in the dark. That's quite possible, Holmes replied calmly. But unlike you, I have not attempted to kill a man to access this vault. Weatherford stiffened. I didn't touch Clarence. No, Holmes said, voice flat. But you watched someone else do it. Back at the manor, Holmes called for a discreet return. He insisted that neither the vault nor Weatherford be revealed until morning. The archaeologist had not protested. Indeed, he seemed resigned, even subdued, as though something within him had broken upon being discovered. Lavinia asked no questions during the walk back. Though her eyes were fixed steadily on Holmes, I caught a trace of something else behind her quiet gaze. Dread. perhaps, or the cold edge of dawning understanding. In the privacy of the study, Holmes poured a brandy and passed one to me. "I need you to do something, Watson," he said, lowering his voice. "Before dawn, of course," I said. He opened a folded paper and laid it on the desk. "This is a coded notice dispatched to Mycroft via the Admiralty Telegraph, encrypted in the Royal cipher. Tell no one, not even Lestrade, when he arrives tomorrow." I studied the page briefly. "You believe Weatherford's discovery is political?" Holmes tapped the desk. "Possibly geopolitical. Sir Benedict was many things: a soldier, an explorer, and, I now suspect, a reluctant courier of knowledge, not meant for our time. There's enough in that chest to ignite a dozen fires across Europe if it falls into ambitious hands. And Weatherford?" I asked. Holmes frowned. "He is not our villain, not quite, but he was the bait." I blinked. "I thought you set the trap." Holmes gave a humorless chuckle. "No, Watson, I merely sprang it. The real trap was laid long ago by Sir Benedict himself." Later that night, Holmes met Lavinia in the drawing room. The fire crackled between them. "You asked why your uncle never trusted you with the truth," he said gently. "I believe it was because he hoped you'd never find yourself here, in the middle of this." She nodded slowly. "And yet I am." Holmes studied her closely. "There's more to come, Miss Rivingham. I must ask for your continued patience, and your silence." "I trust you, Mr. Holmes." He hesitated. "Then you must understand something else. The person behind Clarence's attack and, possibly, your uncle's death is still among us." Her eyes widened, but she said nothing. The firelight danced across her pale features. Holmes stood, adjusting his cuffs. "Tomorrow, we will finish this." Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. Morning. Light poured through the high windows of Briarwell Manor, like a quiet verdict. The rain had ceased sometime in the early hours, leaving the grounds drenched and glistening under a tentative sun. Lestrade arrived just past 9, boots muddy, mustache bristling with damp irritation, flanked by 2 uniformed constables and a cart bearing inspection equipment. Holmes received him with his usual half-amused politeness. "A pleasure, Inspector." "You've brought the cavalry," Lestrade sniffed. "You sent for Scotland Yard in the middle of the night with a coded wire." "My superiors expect a resolution to something." Holmes, "Not more riddles." "You shall have both," Holmes said simply. "But first, we require everyone in the drawing room." Yes, everyone. Within half an hour, the guests and staff of Briarwell were assembled. Lavinia stood near the hearth, poised and wary. Weatherford leaned against a window, arms crossed, face unreadable. Mrs. Hargrave, the housekeeper, hovered near the door, and young Peter, the groundskeeper, lingered by the sideboard. Even little Miss Mallory, the quiet maid, had been summoned, her eyes wide. Holmes took the center of the room, as if it were a stage. "Last evening, Dr. Watson and I accompanied Mr. Weatherford to the hidden vault within the cliffs. There, we discovered an iron chest sealed for decades and the remnants of a secret held by Sir Benedict Rivingham, a secret powerful enough to change allegiances, ruin reputations, and, possibly, threaten the stability of more than one empire." Gasps rippled softly through the room. "The chest has not yet been opened," Holmes continued, "but its presence confirms what I suspected, that the attack on Mr. Clarence, the death of Sir Benedict, and the numerous deceptions unfolding here were not random acts, but rather part of a single, focused effort to gain access to that vault." Lestrade looked up from his notebook. "And who, exactly, do you believe is behind it?" Holmes held up a finger. But let me instead walk you through what has been troubling me. A series of inconsistencies, more on their own, but together, like stars, forming a constellation. He turned to Weatherford. "You discovered the vault's location years ago, but could not open it. The wax map was a guide, yes, but the cipher was its real guardian, and Sir Benedict, being cleverer than most, divided that cipher not on paper, but across people, himself, and someone else." Weatherford looked at Lavinia in surprise, but Holmes shook his head. "Not her. She knew nothing." He stepped closer to the hearth, and his voice dropped. "Then came the wax. Fresh drippings on the map, not a week old, impossible, unless someone had been recreating the puzzle, rehearsing the solution, and the footprint I found near the cellar entrance, smaller than a man's. Damp wax smeared into the tread." He turned toward the maid. Miss Mallory gasped audibly. "I don't know what you mean." Holmes was gentle, but firm. "You're not a maid. Not truly. You arrived here only recently, with forged references. You made yourself invisible, as good spies do. But what gave you away was a scent, a very particular blend of smoke and almond, the kind found in sealing wax prepared in Berlin. Gasps now turned to murmurs. Lavinia took a step backward, stunned. The girl's hands trembled. She dropped a handkerchief. Her accent faltered. I had orders only to copy the cipher, to open the vault and deliver what I found. I didn't harm anyone. And Clarence? Holmes asked sharply. She hesitated. He followed me. I tried to run. He grabbed my arm and I shoved him. I didn't know he would strike his head. I didn't mean to. Lestrade stepped forward, nodding to the constables, who moved swiftly to detain her. She no longer resisted. Holmes turned to Lavinia, who was pale with shock. You were never the target, Miss Rivingham. You were merely the heir to the hiding place. But the true key was held by someone who was never supposed to know it existed. Back in the study, the fire burned low. Holmes poured tea, moving with the composed satisfaction of a man whose theory had finally matched the facts. You see, Watson, he said, stirring sugar into his cup, even the finest puzzle can't account for human ambition. Sir Benedict thought the map alone would be enough to keep the vault safe, but someone always watches, listens, waits. And sometimes it's the smallest detail, a footprint, a smell, a tremble that collapses the whole illusion. And the chest? I asked, still unopened. But it will be handled by those better suited for the political ramifications. I raised an eyebrow. And yet it's your deduction that solved the matter. Holmes gave a modest shrug. Elementary, my dear Watson, though, I confess, it was a beautifully dangerous game. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. Wind returned that evening. Not the tempestuous battering of days past, but a low, restless murmur that passed through the trees like a warning sigh. Holmes stood in the library, his long frame silhouetted against the fire, watching the flames flicker with narrowed eyes. I had just returned from assisting Lestrade in preparing Miss Mallory's transfer to London, her confession now fully recorded and her true identity confirmed. An agent under the employ of a foreign office interested in the secrets buried beneath Briarwell Manor. Holmes, however, was not at ease. There's something unfinished, he murmured, as I set down the teapot between us, the final act in this curious theatre. You believe Miss Mallory wasn't acting alone? I asked. He nodded slowly. Her confession was sincere enough in her role, but not completely. Someone else knew. Someone else planned. She was a pawn. The hand that moved her and is still at large. At that moment, Weatherford entered the room, coat damp and breathing short. Holmes, he said quickly, I've just returned from the Eastern Wing. Lavinia's room is empty. She's gone. I stood. Gone. Holmes didn't flinch. Packed or vanished? Not packed, Weatherford replied grimly. Left in a hurry. Her shawl is missing, and the side servant's door is unlocked. Holmes was already moving, coat on, eyes alight. She's heading for the cliffs. But why? I asked, catching up to him. Because she knew, or guessed, or was told, Holmes said quickly. Miss Rivingham may not have forged a cipher or impersonated a maid, but she had access. He knew the chest existed, and perhaps she knew more than she admitted. She may be seeking what Mallory could not find. Outside, the moors stretched like ink blots under the overcast sky, the ground still sodden from the previous rain. Holmes led the way with uncanny precision, down toward the path that skirted the cliffside vault. The wind pressed against us, cold and insistent, as we neared the outcropping where the iron chest had been. Discovered and then we saw her. Lavinia stood on the cliff's edge, the sea crashing far below, her figure framed by grey clouds and desperation. Her hair was unpinned and whipped about her face. At her feet, the iron chest sat open, the lock cracked, likely with tools borrowed from Weatherford's study. Holmes approached cautiously. You opened it, he said, without accusation. She turned slowly, her face pale and strangely composed. There was no treasure, she said softly. Only letters, pages and pages of correspondences, old, yellowed, political and personal. He kept them all. My grandfather. Holmes nodded. Blackmail, leverage, wartime correspondence, family secrets, everything Sir Benedict feared the world might discover. Enough to make him a target. A shudder passed through her. I thought I could end it, destroy it, burn it all before anyone else could use it. Then why run? Holmes asked gently. Why disappear? Her composure faltered. Because I did know. I recognized Mallory. Months ago, in Vienna. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure who I could trust. And when Clarence was attacked, I panicked. I feared suspicion would fall on me. Holmes took a slow step forward. And now, she looked down at the chest. I don't want it. Any of it. Let the past rot beneath the sea. Perhaps, Holmes replied. But truth, Miss Rivingham, is seldom so easily buried. Lestrade arrived moments later with 2 constables. Lavinia didn't resist. She handed the documents to Holmes in silence. Later, as we returned to the manor, Holmes was quiet, lost in thought. I finally broke the silence. You believe her. I believe she was frightened, he said. But her fear was not of justice, it was of legacy. The sins of her grandfather, the power those letters held, and the real architect of all this. Holmes gave a thin smile. Still unknown, but one piece at a time. Watson, one move ahead of the enemy. That is all we require. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in the final. Clue revealed the morning after Lavinia Rivingham's failed escape was a bleak one. Fog lay thick over the hills, rendering Briarwell Manor little more than a smudge upon the landscape. Inside, the house seemed subdued, as though mourning the secrets that had emerged from its walls. Weatherford moved through the corridors with mechanical precision, and even Lestrade, normally buoyed by the scent of a case drawing to a close, seemed uncertain. Holmes, on the other hand, was sharpening his thoughts as keenly as a scalpel. We found him in the library, seated not in the armchair but cross-legged upon the floor. The candle-wax map unrolled before him. The box of old letters recovered from Lavinia's attempted theft lay open beside him. He did not look up as we entered. Watson, he murmured, consider this sequence. I leaned over the map. The wax markings were as we had left them, except now, Holmes had arranged several of the aged letters around it, each open to particular phrases underlined in red. Sir Benedict's correspondences contain references to naval deployments, encrypted trade negotiations, and curious mentions of the phrase waxing quarter, repeated across a dozen letters. I frowned. A code. A location, Holmes replied, tapping the edge of the map. Note, the wax lines here drawn not haphazardly, but with careful repetition. 4 corners. One is faintly smudged, but the other 3 are clean. Now, see how they align with the manor's not in measurement but in orientation. He rotated the map 90 degrees. The wax lines mark a quadrant, and if you position this, he plucked 1 letter from the pile over this corner. The dates correspond to the building of the eastern greenhouse wing. That was never used after the 2nd year, was it? No, Weatherford said, stepping closer, a trace of curiosity returning to his features. It was sealed shortly after Lady Briarwell's passing. Holmes nodded. Exactly. I propose that Sir Benedict constructed a vault, their one, that predates the iron chest. Something deeper. The letters in this box were the bait, a layer of truth meant to distract. But the real prize, the true legacy, remains hidden. Lestrade, who had been quiet until now, muttered, You think there's another hiding place? I do, Holmes said, rising smoothly, and I believe our unknown conspirator is aware of it as well. That is why Miss Mallory was never allowed to succeed. She was sent to search, to fail publicly. Then someone within could act under cover of the confusion. But who? I asked. Holmes gave a small smile. That, my dear Watson, is the question we're about to answer. He led us swiftly through the eastern corridor, to a narrow servants' passage dusted with cobwebs and silence. At its end, a door, long warped by disuse, gave way to the forgotten greenhouse, a glass vault of dirt and decay. Vines grown wild over shattered benches and rusted tools. There, Holmes said, pointing to a loose stone beneath the northernmost planter. You'll find a steel ring embedded in the mortar. Weatherford knelt, pried it loose, and a hollow space yawned open beneath. A metal ladder led down into darkness. Holmes descended without hesitation. What we discovered was not another map or box of relics. It was a sealed compartment lined with parchment scrolls, ledgers, and a single velvet-bound journal. Sir Benedict's personal diary. Holmes flipped it open with reverence, eyes scanning line after line. The girl plays her part well, but the real danger lies with the solicitor. He suspects too much. Holmes read aloud. It was necessary to divert attention away from the greenhouse vault. Let them find the iron chest better than the truth about the cipher key. He looked up slowly. There it is. The motive, the misdirection. This case was never about the letters. It was about what the letters led to, a key to something far greater. And now, I believe I know who engineered the entire charade. Then who? Holmes, I asked, heart quickening. He closed the journal with finality. Not yet. Not until the final gathering. There is still one piece left to move. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The drawing room of Briarwell Manor had never felt colder, though the hearth crackled with fresh fire. The heavy drapes were drawn back, letting the slate-grey light of the afternoon filter through the high windows. Holmes stood before the fireplace, arms clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed not on us, but somewhere deeper into the very structure of the truth. He had summoned every person connected to the case, and now the room was crowded with tension. Weatherford, stern and dignified, occupied a place near the far window. Lavinia Rivingham sat, pale but composed, a fresh bruise darkening the edge of her jaw from her failed escape. Miriam Mallory, still bristling with righteous indignation, paced silently behind the settee. Inspector Lestrade stood beside me, his notebook already in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, voice measured, "I thank you for attending. As you all know, this house has long been haunted not by ghosts, but by secrets. What began as the death of an old man has unraveled into a thread of deception far more elaborate than first imagined." He turned to the table where the iron chest had been placed, now open, its letters scattered in plain view. These documents were a diversion. Authentic, yes. Sensitive, undoubtedly, but not the true objective. They were placed there as a controlled leak, a feint. He tapped the edge of the candlewax map, now pinned beside the papers. This, however, this was the real puzzle, and it led us to something far more important. Sir Benedict's hidden journal, buried beneath the old greenhouse floor. Gasps rippled through the room. Holmes continued, his tone sharpening. "The journal confirms what I had begun to suspect. The entire affair was orchestrated, every piece of it, by someone with both proximity and motive. Someone who stood to gain from concealing the truth while guiding others to a carefully planted version of it." Weatherford stepped forward. "And who, Mr. Holmes, do you suggest was capable of such a thing?" Holmes turned slowly to face him. "That is the purpose of this gathering, Mr. Weatherford. But before I offer an accusation, I must ask each of you a question. One that may seem trivial, but I assure you, it is not." He pointed to the map. "Did any of you, at any point, touch or alter this map before it came into my possession?" Silence. Then Lavinia raised a hand faintly. "Only when I was studying it in my room, before it was locked away. Miss Mallory." She shook her head sharply. "I never had access to it. I was only told it existed after I failed to find the chest." "Weatherford." "I sealed it per Sir Benedict's wishes. I have not laid a hand on it since." Holmes gave a tight nod. "And yet," he said, "there is a clear discrepancy. A fingerprint left in wax, barely visible, but distinct. Not yours, Miss Rivingham. Not yours, Mr. Weatherford, and certainly not mine or Watson's." He moved to the sideboard and removed a folded cloth. From it, he withdrew a piece of clear wax paper, upon which the faint whirls of a fingerprint were preserved. Lestrade stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "Whose, then?" Holmes paused for only a moment. "The answer," he said softly, "lies not in the print itself, but in the handwriting of a letter hidden at the bottom of the journal. A letter addressed, not to Sir Benedict, but from him." He removed a final page from the journal, and read, "To the one I once trusted above all others. Know that if you are reading this, you have outplayed even me. But beware, secrets are fuel, and they burn those who wield them carelessly." Holmes folded the paper and met our eyes. "The author of this chaos is in this room, and with your permission, I will now demonstrate how the entire game was played." No one moved. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "I will require only one more moment to set the final piece in motion," Holmes said. Then, with deliberate calm, he turned and left the room, leaving us all in stunned silence. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. When Holmes re-entered the drawing room, the silence had thickened into something near oppressive. His footsteps were light, yet they seemed to echo through the air, like the toll of a bell. With careful precision, he set a small parcel upon the mantelpiece wrapped in oilskin, streaked with soil. "I have just returned from the garden," he announced. Specifically, from beneath the floor of the old greenhouse where Sir Benedict's journal lay buried, accompanied by the last piece of the puzzle. He unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a fragment of scorched parchment, curled at the edges, its ink partially obliterated by fire. "It took some coaxing," he said, "but enough remained to make its content unmistakable. This was the original map, unmarred by wax or tampering, a direct guide to the hidden location of the journal. Which begs the question, why was a different map sealed in wax placed in the chest for others to find? Holmes turned toward us slowly, letting the question linger. The answer is manipulation, a carefully crafted redirection meant to lead others to the wrong conclusion, or at least a partial truth. Inspector Lestrade raised a hand. But who could have orchestrated such a thing? It would require access, timing, intimate knowledge of Sir Benedict's affairs. Indeed, Holmes replied, eyes narrowing. Only a handful of individuals meet that criteria. But of them, only one possessed the psychological motive to construct such an elaborate deception. He approached Lavinia, who sat clutching the arm of her chair, her gaze unblinking. At first, Holmes said gently, I considered you, Miss Rivingham. You had knowledge of the estate's layout, a questionable history with the deceased, and if gossip is to be believed, a strained relationship with your adoptive uncle. Lavinia flinched slightly, but said nothing. But, Holmes continued, you lacked one crucial quality, patience. This scheme required a slow burn, a kind of strategic forethought that you do not possess. No, your crime, if you had committed one, would have been brash, impulsive, perhaps even dramatic. This crime, by contrast, was cold, methodical, hidden beneath layers of half-truths. He turned now to face Miriam Mallory. I also considered Miss Mallory. You had proximity, motive, even, given your father's removal from Sir Benedict's will. But your anger is too overt, your desire too plain. You are not a deceiver by nature, you are a hammer, not a scalpel. Miriam bristled, her mouth tightening, but she, too, said nothing. Holmes stepped aside, gaze settling now upon Mr. Weatherford, who had remained eerily calm throughout. You, Mr. Weatherford, are a man accustomed to silence, to secrets. You've served the family for decades, and in doing so, have acquired more knowledge than most blood relations. And yet, your loyalty remained unshaken till it was betrayed. Weatherford's eyes narrowed. Betrayed? Holmes nodded slowly. Sir Benedict, in his final act of paranoia, decided not to entrust you with the journal. He suspected that even you might one day use its contents to your advantage, and so, he misled you, gave you a false version of the map, laced with a trail of candle wax so distinctive, it left behind a fingerprint that, I must tell you, matches precisely with one we lifted from your ink blotter in the upstairs study. Lestrade stiffened. You're certain? I never speak unless I am. Weatherford's shoulders squared. Even if that were true, what crime have I committed? There is no body, no weapon, no missing fortune. I merely safeguarded the legacy of a man who had lost his mind. You tampered with evidence, Holmes said coldly. You substituted one map for another, guiding the investigation away from the truth. You staged the chest's discovery so that Miss Rivingham would be implicated, and when she wasn't, you attempted to burn the original map and journal unsuccessfully. As it turned out, you underestimated the weatherproofing of wax-sealed parchment. I protected this house, Weatherford replied, his voice hardening, and I protected its master's wishes. No, Holmes said, stepping forward, you protected yourself, because buried in that journal were not only state secrets but personal ones, proof that Sir Benedict had long suspected you of siphoning funds, of forging entries, of intercepting correspondences meant for Parliament. The room exploded with overlapping gasps. Weatherford remained perfectly still. Holmes drew a breath. You didn't kill Sir Benedict, no, but you feared that his final writings would be your undoing, and in trying to destroy them, you revealed far more than you concealed. Silence reigned at last. Weatherford looked to the fire, then back at Holmes. I suppose, he murmured, I should have burned the greenhouse as well. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Inspector Lestrade stepped forward, his hand resting on the polished silver of his pocket watch chain. Alfred Weatherford, he said gravely, you are hereby placed under arrest on suspicion of evidence tampering, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and misappropriation of personal effects. Weatherford didn't flinch. He stood with the rigid dignity of a man who had long rehearsed for disgrace. His face betrayed no emotion, not anger, nor fear, nor regret. Watson watched, his heart heavy, as the butler, the stoic shadow behind the family's grandeur, was led from the room with the soft clink of steel. For all Holmes had revealed, for all the truths unearthed from the garden and the journals, the sight of Weatherford in chains still struck an oddly tragic note. Miriam Mallory exhaled, slumping into a chair. So it wasn't me, she whispered, half to herself. It wasn't Lavinia. It wasn't about the will. No, Holmes replied, his tone cool but not unkind. Though your tempers and ambitions clouded the investigation, neither of you bore the burden of true guilt. Lavinia, who had said nothing for some time, now turned to Holmes with eyes that glistened not with tears, but with the heat of humiliation. "Then I suppose I owe you an apology, Mr. Holmes, and perhaps to myself as well. I thought I was being hunted." "You were," Holmes replied, "but not by me. Rather by the web of secrecy and fear that Weatherford spun to protect his misdeeds. He needed you to seem volatile, suspicious. He planted the wax-sealed map in a place he knew you would find, counting on your temperament to lead you directly into the lion's mouth." "He never said a word," Lavinia murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "All these years, and I thought he was the one person I could trust." "A common illusion," Holmes said softly. "But in truth, trust is the very currency a deceiver trades in." Lestrade reappeared from the hallway, brushing specks of rain from his coat. "We've secured the greenhouse. The journal will be taken into evidence and examined by our records office. And as for Weatherford, he's offered no resistance. Rather calm, all things considered. He is a man who has lived with his guilt for years," Holmes remarked. "The moment of capture must feel like a kind of relief." A beat passed. Then, from his inner pocket, Holmes retrieved a slim, folded sheet of parchment. "This," he said, placing it in Watson's hands, "was the final page of Sir Benedict's journal, miraculously preserved, likely because Weatherford never unsealed it. It contains no state secrets, no betrayals or codes." Watson opened it gently. The paper, though yellowed with age, bore neat, flowing ink. "If one day this should find the light, let it be known that the greatest mystery was not one of nations or enemies. It was within my own heart. For all my travels, it was love and trust that I could never fully master. If this house survives me, may it do so without the shadows I leave behind." Watson folded the note and exhaled. "A confession, or perhaps a lament." Holmes gave the faintest nod. Sir Benedict feared not treason, but truth. The journal was not a weapon, it was a mirror. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm had finally eased. The grey clouds began to thin, and the first pale bands of morning light slid across the drawing-room floor. "What will happen to the estate?" Watson asked. "That," Holmes replied, "falls to the family ore. What remains of it? Perhaps now, unburdened of its false legacies, this house might begin again." Miriam stood. "There's much to do. The affairs, the archives, the staff, ... and perhaps," Lavinia added with a tentative glance toward her cousin, "something resembling peace." This, satisfied that his task was nearly done, nodded to Holmes. "Once again, you've done what none of us could." Holmes gave a wry smile. "As always, Inspector, it is merely a matter of observation and inference. Nothing more." Lestrade shook his head, grumbling as he made his way toward the door. "And here I thought we'd solved it with that chest of wax. Fool's trail, that was." When he'd gone, Holmes turned once more to the window. The grounds of Benedict House were still, but no longer ominous. The ghosts, it seemed, had less power in the daylight. "Come, Watson," he said. "The puzzle is complete." And with that, Holmes turned his back on the case, as he always did, leaving behind one more mystery untangled, one more thread pulled free from the tapestry of deception. Chapter 18. Holmes. Final reflection. It was well past noon by the time Holmes and I found ourselves once again in the rattling comfort of a railway carriage, returning to London. The case, if not neatly tied with ribbon, had been folded and put away, like a curious letter that had at last been answered. Holmes reclined against the plush upholstery, his fingers steepled, his eyes fixed not on the countryside rolling past the window, but on something far more distant within. I had long since closed my notebook. What could I record now that I had not already chronicled? Justice had been served, the villain revealed, the puzzle solved, and yet there lingered a strange silence between us, neither oppressive nor cold, but contemplative, like the hush that follows the final note of a symphony. "I must confess," I ventured at last, "this case left me more adrift than most. The candle-wax map, the hidden page, the peculiar urgency of Weatherford's deception, it felt less like a crime and more like a confession." Holmes did not move. "Precisely," he said, "and therein lies its singularity." I leaned forward. "But why go to such lengths? Why guard a map that meant nothing? Why destroy records, stage misdirection, and cast suspicion upon innocent people, all to protect what amounts to a dying man's sentiment?" "Because sentiment," Holmes said softly, "can be more dangerous than fact." Sir Benedict's journal did not contain state secrets or military codes. It contained remorse, genuine personal remorse. To a man like Weatherford, that posed the greatest threat of all. I frowned. But how so? Holmes unfolded his hands and sat upright, his gaze sharpening. Weatherford had built his entire identity on loyalty. Loyalty to the Mallory name, to its legacy, to the illusion of greatness. He could stomach the weight of secrets, but he could not allow history to portray Sir Benedict as vulnerable. In Weatherford's eyes, to be vulnerable was to be diminished. A Mallory must not weep, must not doubt. They must be, in every regard, mythic. I nodded slowly. And so he became the myth, the curator of legend. Exactly. He distorted the truth, destroyed the journal's final confession, and misled the family, all in the name of protecting a man who no longer required protection. And the map. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile, an artifact of irony. It was the very page he feared, a metaphor rendered literal. Sir Benedict, knowing he lacked the courage to reveal his heart, folded it into a cipher and waxed it shut. Perhaps, in some deeply buried hope, he wanted it found, but only after his legacy had faded. I exhaled, still absorbing the layers of the case. And yet, no treasure, no grand scheme, just a man's remorse, which, Holmes replied, is often the heaviest burden. The whistle of the train cut through our conversation as we began to slow. The London skyline approached, cold and familiar. Holmes, I said after a long pause, you never do seem terribly moved by these things. Even now, after all that was uncovered, you appear, untouched. Holmes looked at me then, the faintest trace of something unreadable in his eyes, something closer to melancholy than I had ever seen before. I am moved, Watson, he said, but not in the way others are. I do not grieve as you do, nor do I rejoice. My satisfaction lies in clarity, in the unveiling of what was hidden. The truth, you see, is not always comforting, but it is always necessary. I said nothing, struck once more by how little I truly understood the man who had become my closest companion. He was a creature of order in a world of chaos, a lantern in the fog, but not immune to the very shadows he illuminated. The train gave a final lurch, and we gathered our things. As we stepped onto the platform at Paddington, I could not resist a final word. Will you write this one up, Holmes, or shall I? He looked at me. If you must, Watson, though do omit the more sentimental bits. Candlewax and confessions are not the stuff of legend. On the contrary, I smiled. I believe they're precisely that. He gave a half smile, then turned, his coat catching the wind like a curtain drawing closed, and just like that, Holmes was already moving on his mind, chasing the next shadow, the next riddle, the next truth. But I, as ever, would remember.